Megan grabbed my laptop like she'd been waiting for permission, spun it toward the table, and the screen lit up with numbers that felt like a slap. $13,834,200 and pending contracts close to $500,000. The room went quiet in the way a theater goes quiet when someone shouts. Uncle Eric froze mid-chew, Mom went from smiling to red in the span of a breath, and my father's hand tightened around his wine glass like it might save him. Megan's smug face cut into the air. "Is this all yours, Em?" she said, like she was reading from a script she'd rehearsed for weeks. I felt the blood go hot and cold at the same time. Years of being the invisible kid, of being shipped off to Grandma Rita whenever I sniffled, flashed through me like a bad slideshow. I could see the faces at every recital where no one clapped for me, the empty seats at awards nights I had begged them to attend, their whole lives orbiting around Megan's small dramas. I stood up so fast my chair scraped the floor. "Yes," I said, and the single word felt too small for what I needed to say. "Yes, it's mine, I built it." Megan laughed like she knew a secret I didn't. "Built it? Where? Under the couch with Dad's missing change." Her voice had that practiced cruelty I'd heard since childhood. Mom's eyes were flashing now. "Emily, how could you hide this all this time?" she demanded, sounding more betrayed than proud. The rest of the table started talking at once, a hard blur of what-ifs and why-nots. Someone dropped a dish quietly in the kitchen, and you could hear the crack like a punctuation mark. I tried to explain between the tidal wave of questions. "I didn't hide it to hurt you. I did it because I learned early that if I wanted to be seen, I had to make myself impossible to ignore. I worked nights. I learned to authenticate pieces. I saved and I took risks." My voice shook. I could feel old, small Emily sitting behind my ribs listening. Megan cut me off. "So all those months you've been helping out were lies? You were the one sending the money while we sat here scraping by." Her words landed like stones. "I sent money because I didn't want you all to lose the house," I said, and for once I decided to tell the truth without a buffer. "Because I didn't want Mom and Dad to starve or go without medication when they needed it. I thought I could do both, keep helping and keep living my life. I thought secrecy would spare everyone ugly conversations." Dad finally spoke, his voice thin and rattled. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have been proud." The word proud hit me like a hand. I remembered so many nights where being proud of me would have made everything easier, but that had never been their reflex. The room turned into a courtroom. Megan played the prosecutor like she'd always been trained for this. Years of being mother's favorite had honed her into someone who knew how to score points. "You should have given us more," she said. "You should have set up trust accounts. You should have shown us how to live." Her tone implied I was guilty of withholding not just cash but moral instruction. Aunt Linda, who'd once fed me detective novels when I waited out parents' distractions, looked torn between delight at the drama and discomfort at the attack. I told them about Whitmore & Co., about finding that brooch on a midnight shift and selling it for what felt like my first real victory. "Do you remember Grandma Rita?" I asked, because it felt right. "She taught me to spot a wrong cut or a fake clasp. That's where it began." Grandma Rita, my refuge, my jewelry teacher, sat quietly, smiling small, and that steadied me. But the table kept circling back to money as if it were a verdict rather than a topic for conversation. "You should have shared," Mom said again, softer now but with that old tilt of accusation in her voice. "You kept us in the dark, you watched us struggle." I thought about all the nights I'd tacked extra skin on bills, transferring small amounts that added up to comfort for them. I thought about Megan's designer shoes and the Instagram posts of vacations where she posed like someone who'd never known limits. "I gave what I could when I could," I said. "And yes, maybe I should have told you. But I also needed to protect the business. I needed to keep things quiet until I was sure." That line, "protect the business," meant something they couldn't see. I'd used my car as collateral the day I opened my first tiny office above a noodle shop. I'd eaten ramen and learned to solder under a single desk lamp. The brooch that sold for $51,000 felt like vindication at the time. The Rothman pendant that sold for $254,000 changed the game. My manager told me I was wasting my talent if I stayed in someone else's shadow. I remember thinking then that if I ever made it, I'd never go back to being the child who needed permission to exist. The louder voices at the table wanted immediate solutions, accounts to open, percentages to hand over, vacations to fund. They saw balanced numbers, not the sleepless nights and the legal fees and the taxes and the lonely choices. "You owe us," Megan said flatly like it was a fact carved in stone. "You built this on our backs." Her words were neat and cruel. I almost laughed at how sure she sounded, but instead I felt my mouth go dry. "I'm not a bank," I said, and the sentence surprised me with its finality. "I have obligations. I can't just hand over everything because someone feels entitled." The room recoiled a little like I'd thrown a rock through their idea of family. Dad looked like he might cry. Mom's face softened a fraction, then hardened again with the familiar fear that had shaped her parenting. "We thought you wanted nothing to do with us," she whispered, which felt like both accusation and plea tangled together. By the time dessert was ignored and the caterers were quietly moving plates away, the fallout was already beginning. People called me names and others asked me to explain more. Megan said she'd lawyer up if I did do the right thing. I felt the old reflex to appease rise, the urge to make things smooth again, but something else had shifted inside me. Years of being sidelined had taught me to build walls, not bridges, and for once those walls felt necessary. I gathered my coat and walked out into a cold November night with every eye burning at my back. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't going to turn back because someone expected me to. Sorry for the quick interruption. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe, and leave comment below. It really helps the channel grow. Alright, let's jump back into the story. They treated Megan like fine glass, the kind you wrap in tissue and warn kids not to touch, and I learned to take up as little room as possible. My mother, Teresa, who kept a faint tremor in her voice whenever Megan coughed, hovered over her with apologies and worry. My father, Mark, retreated into that quiet, steadying shell that made him useful when things were simple but useless when things got complicated. From the start, Megan, my sister, became everyone's first concern after a scary neonatal crisis. I was the kid who got shipped off the moment someone sniffled or needed a break. The message was simple and brutal. Megan came first, and you, Emily, were an afterthought. At first it felt like an adventure being sent to Grandma Rita, my grandmother, or to Aunt Linda, my aunt. Grandma Rita had these perfect, lumpy cookies and taught me how to spot a clasp on a brooch even when the light was bad. Aunt Linda kept a pile of detective novels and let me read until my eyes went wide. Their houses were worlds where I could be loud and small and allowed to stretch. I learned shorthand, how to laugh at things that weren't funny, how to tuck my accomplishments into pockets like spare change. There was a freedom there, but freedom that was given because I was unwanted at home, not because I'd earned it. Soon the pattern hardened. Every time I showed the smallest sign of illness, someone would look at me like I might break the fragile piece of Megan's recovery. We can't risk anything, my mother would say, eyes full of fear, so I packed a small bag and left. It wasn't presented as punishment, it was framed as protection. Protection for whom I wondered. I thought I'd been spared hard things, but really I was being erased. When Megan had a cold, the house lit up with plans and calls and sympathy. When I had the flu, the only plan was to get me out of the way. I kept trying to earn attention in other places. I played violin because the bow felt like a wand. The music let me speak without having to compete for air. I spent Saturdays at the library learning how to solder and read tiny catalog numbers Grandma Rita pointed out. Science fair ribbons, straight A's, debate trophies accumulated in a box under my bed, while the family calendar filled with appointments for Megan's physical therapy, her specialist visits, the small things that required big attention. When Megan took the stage at a preschool recital, the whole family came. When I played Vivaldi at the high school auditorium, there were a few polite claps and then silence. Those silences taught me to be self-reliant in a sharp, efficient way. If no one showed up when I won, I learned to build celebrations for myself. I learned to pay attention to what people ignored and then become very good at it, how to spot a fake hallmark, how to read micro-scratches that told stories dealers often missed. The skills were practical and lonely. I hustled at Lena's diner, learning to count change fast enough to feel safe. I studied at night not because anyone asked me to, but because I wanted a life that wouldn't fit into an apologetic note. There were real hurts that never had bandages. Once I came home with a science fair medal and Mom barely glanced up from a list of doctor appointments. Her hands kept moving, checking things off as if my win were another task. I remember that feeling of standing in the doorway holding a trophy that seemed suddenly small. The lesson stuck: make your own proof. Don't expect applause from people who have practiced being only afraid. I became an invisible worker of my own destiny, piling late nights and small wins into a future that would not ask permission to exist. Of course, this built a kind of privacy that later looked like secrecy. I kept things small because being big around them felt like a risk they would not be able to carry. When I later made my way into Whitmore & Co. cataloging rooms filled with history, I brought that same quiet focus. I learned to love the quiet way edges told truth about age and origin, and I learned to trust what my eyes and hands said over the conversations at our family table. Grandma Rita taught me that a clasp tells a story if you know how to listen. Aunt Linda taught me to read motives behind closed doors. Those lessons became my toolkit. Even now, I can feel the old ache when people ask why I didn't share sooner. They hear the numbers and see a balance, but they can't hear the years I spent proving to myself that I could do this alone. The childhood message, be self-reliant or be invisible, was brutal, but it taught me to build something that belonged only to me. It also taught me why, when the laptop flipped on the table that Thanksgiving, I didn't flinch at showing the truth. I'd already learned that being quiet could keep people safe, and being loud could put me at risk. I had chosen my path, and that choice was rooted in all the small exits those early years forced me into. I learned to treat high school like a machine I was building one part at a time, and I ran it myself. I became a precision student, color-coded notes, flashcards taped inside my locker, and a schedule that left no room for aimless time. My hands learned two rhythms: the careful pen strokes of an editor fixing copy and the faster, rougher motions of scooping fries and pouring coffee at Lena's diner. "You'll burn out," my coworker would tell me, but I needed the money and the muscle memory of work. The diner taught me how to be quick, polite, and invisible when I had to be, and how to smile under pressure without losing sight of the goal. At school, I joined debate because words felt like tools I could use, and I practiced until I could hold an argument like a lever. I argued for things in class that didn't matter to most people but mattered to me: fair funding for school labs, better library hours, a debate about arts budgets that I won by 2 votes. My name began showing up on ribbons and plaques, and I kept those small proofs in a shoebox under my bed. I became editor of the paper because I liked making things clean and true. Editing was quiet control. It let me shape how people read facts and stories. When I read my byline, I felt less like someone who had to leave the room when lights went out. I applied to universities on my own, late at night with a coffee by my bedside and a stack of brochures like tiny maps. I didn't ask mom or dad for advice because I knew it would turn into worry or guilt. I didn't want them to wrap my choices in fear for Megan's health. I wanted a ticket out that was mine. When Westbridge offered me a full scholarship, I cried in the kitchen for a full minute and then folded my acceptance letter into my planner like a map. That scholarship felt like my first clean victory, not for their approval but for my freedom. I remember telling myself, quiet as a prayer, that this is for me and not for anyone else's approval. College was the space where skills met purpose. I took classes in materials science and history of design, things that tied back to Grandma Rita's brooches and Aunt Linda's detective puzzles. I worked nights at a campus cafe and cataloged estate items over summer internships, learning to read paperwork and track provenance like a detective follows a trail. I learned negotiation by selling small finds and convincing skeptical buyers by pointing to tiny scratches that proved authenticity. Each contract I closed was another quiet proof that the path I'd chosen made sense. Meanwhile, Megan kept existing in appliances of attention therapy appointments, social events where sympathy was currency, and later, the polished theater of Instagram posts that showed curated happiness. She drifted through extracurricular drama and then through adult life with a steady stream of people ready to perform care for her. I watched her from a distance and felt a complicated thing: love stitched with cold clarity. I didn't want to punish her, but I also didn't want to be erased again, so I learned to be exact. I learned to organize everything in ways other people couldn't see at first glance. Spreadsheets for budgets, filing systems for receipts, a vault of contacts for appraisals and collectors. Those habits, organization, negotiation, and patience, became the backbone of the business I would later build. Patience was the hardest. It meant sitting on a lead and waiting for proof, refusing to give in to the easy sale of a fake with a polished story. Negotiation meant learning not to be flattered into bad deals. Organization meant that when I finally opened my first office above a noodle shop, I already had a system for cataloging client info, conservation records, and a chain of custody that would stand up in court if needed. I wasn't just saving money at Lena's. I was learning how to manage an operation with deadlines and people who depended on me. There were moments that felt like small rebellions. I remember the first time I took a bus across town to an estate sale beside the river and returned with a Victorian brooch for practically nothing. I cleaned it in the bathroom sink, traced the maker's mark with a magnifying glass, and felt a pulse of pride that had nothing to do with applause. The first brooch I helped consign that sold for a real sum felt like I was finally being efficient with my life's temper. I'd taken all those small rejections and turned them into a resource. The discipline I built in high school, making lists, double-checking facts, and working night shifts, gave me a spine. When I accepted a job cataloging at Whitmore & Co., it felt like a continuation of that work ethic. The company wanted precision and quiet drive. I gave both and then some. I spent nights cross-referencing catalogs, calling distant relatives, and learning the language of hallmarks. The work taught me to watch for the little things that tell big stories and to be patient enough to let those stories unfold. By the time a brooch from the Kingston estate sold for $51,000, I knew the long pattern had paid off. I had traded invisibility for a skill set that no one could take away, and that felt like the cleanest kind of freedom. I started at Whitmore & Co., a Cleveland auction house, doing the tedious work nobody wants: inventory lists, careful note-taking, and long nights in fluorescent light. My job felt small and exact, like lining up dominoes perfectly. I learned to look for details other people missed: tiny marks, odd soldering, mismatched screws, small things that hint at bigger truths. The hours were long and the pay modest, but the work let me turn things over slowly, and that pace suited me. It felt right to work with objects that held stories, and I liked that my hands did the telling. The Kingston estate came in like any other: boxes, trunks, a surprising amount of costume jewelry that smelled faintly of old perfume. I was cataloging things the way I always did: photograph, measure, note, maker's marks, when a brooch caught my eye. It was Art Deco, a little misfiled among the plastic flowers. It didn't read like the rest: the metal had a weight, the stones had a quiet depth. I studied it at lunch and on breaks. I felt the small, familiar pull of curiosity I'd had since Grandma Rita first showed me a broken clasp and said, "Listen to it." I spent my evenings on that brooch. For 2 weeks I did unpaid research, scrolling through auction archives, contacting a professor who specialized in period jewelry, and taking an online gemology course that ate my free time. I even took the brooch apart carefully in my tiny studio apartment to check solder marks and hallmarks, then put it back together like a promise. I wasn't sure I was right. I just knew the details didn't add up to costume. I practiced my explanation in the mirror because I was used to people doubting what I saw. When I told my manager, Mr. Conway, he laughed a little at first and called me persistent. He is a manager who appreciates results more than bravado, and I respected him for that. "Prove it," he said, and handed me a stack of older sale records and a magnifying loupe. I gave him everything I had: research notes, comparisons, emails from the professor who nudged me toward a manufacturer name. I remember the moment he sat back, reading my packet, and his expression shifting from skeptical to thoughtful. "If you're right," he said slowly, "this changes things." The brooch went to auction with my attribution pinned to its catalog entry. The sale day was a quiet kind of pressure. People sat in folding chairs and watched numbers roll by, but the brooch drew a small crowd of quiet, serious collectors. When the hammer fell, it was for $51,000. The room exhaled like someone had released a held breath. I felt a shock that was part relief and part strange vindication. All those evenings of unpaid work, the late nights on online classes, and the tiny expenditures for reference books suddenly had monetary value attached to them. My meticulousness, which had always been my armor, had become currency. After that sale, Mr. Conway started giving me darker, trickier assignments: pieces with messy paperwork, estates with family stories that didn't match up with the objects on the table. He trusted me to call lawyers, to contact distant relatives, and to tell clients when an item was more rumor than reality. My side projects began as favors. A private collector would call asking for a quick look, or an estate attorney would email a grainy photo asking if it was worth cataloging. Those calls crept into my evenings and then my weekends. They were small consults at first: cash in envelopes or checks slid across a conference table, but they grew. I learned the business of discretion as I learned the trade, quietly, patiently, without fanfare. Private collectors wanted confidentiality, estate lawyers wanted speed and accuracy. I found myself in phone booths and back rooms, making calls and arranging secret inspections. My name started to travel through a certain circuit: estate lawyers in Cleveland, a collector upstate, a dealer who had a nose for overlooked pieces. Each successful attribution led to another, and my confidence grew in direct proportion to the trust other people put in me. It wasn't glamorous. I still ate cheap takeout and took the bus, and I felt the strain of doing two jobs at once. But building that reputation taught me a vital business lesson: patience pays. When you wait, when you do the quiet work no one notices, patterns emerge, provenance unfolds, connections happen. The brooch from Kingston that sold for $51,000 remained a milestone, proof that the work I loved could support me and that my careful eyes had a market. From that point forward, small nights and slow investigations weren't just habit. They were the beginning of something that could not be taken away. Mr. Conway, my manager at Whitmore & Co., said one afternoon, like it was obvious, "You're wasting your eye on other people's catalogs." His voice wasn't loud, but it hit a place in me that had learned to listen for permission. He pushed more than praised, handed me a list of contacts, and said, "Start somewhere, you're ready." I read his words in the cramped break room and felt a mix of excitement and terror that I'd practiced feeling since high school. I took the leap like someone stepping off a low wall, thinking gravity might be kinder if I moved fast. I used my car as collateral, drained the small nest egg I'd squirreled away from diner shifts and early catalog gigs, and rented a tiny office above a noodle shop. The building smelled like broth and laundry. The Wi-Fi only worked if I sat by the single window and braced my knees against the radiator. It felt ridiculous and perfect at the same time: my first office. A place that made no promises except the ones I wrote down. The first months were brutal in ways I hadn't fully imagined. Loan letters arrived with fonts that looked like accusations. Banks called in tones that suggested disappointment more than business. I woke sweating some nights, replaying every decision that had led me there, the car title, the savings drained, the signatures on the lease. I learned the hard shape of risk, how it sits in your chest and makes your hands shake while you keep working. I ate whatever was cheap and skipped a few comforts because the business needed the small cash flow. Then, like a story that changes tone mid-chapter, a dealer walked into my doorway with a battered box and a careful smile. He said, "I've got something you might want to look at, Victorian brooches, all of them together." I spent days on that collection, checking settings, comparing maker marks, and calling a couple of old contacts I'd kept from Whitmore. The collection turned out to be better than anyone expected. When the numbers landed, my 10% commission for placing pieces and consulting came to $92,000. For the first time, I slept through the night and woke up thinking not just about bills but about the longer arc. That windfall didn't erase the fear, but it changed the conversation people had with me. Calls multiplied. Estate lawyers asking for discreet appraisals, private collectors wanting verification before purchases, even a quiet fax from a previous auction house asking if I could take on a complicated Rothman lot. I learned to schedule meetings so I wouldn't be pulled in a dozen directions at once. I learned to say no sometimes, which felt like a muscle I'd never exercised. Clients liked that I was exact and private. They wanted someone who wouldn't parade their holdings or invite drama. Within a couple of years, I had enough work to hire help. I found a junior gemologist, a diligent person who loved small details the way I did. Training someone felt like passing along a flashlight in a cave. Suddenly, I could see further into the tunnel. We moved from the noodle shop office to a modest downtown space with real security and a lockbox room. The new office had working Wi-Fi everywhere and a coffee machine that didn't need coaxing. We painted the walls a neutral color because we wanted clients to notice the jewelry, not the decor. We kept the business small on purpose. Discretion was our currency, no flashy ads, no social media showboating. We built a reputation on quiet things, accurate provenance reports, airtight chain of custody documentation, and recommendations that could stand up in court if contested. People started to refer us because we hadn't put the work on a billboard. We'd done it where our clients needed it done, often behind closed doors. I learned how to manage contracts, how to invoice politely, and how to hire an honest accountant who taught me that being meticulous in bookkeeping was as important as spotting a maker's mark. There were close calls, clients who tried to negotiate too hard, a shipping mistake that nearly cost a valuable pendant, and a late-night threat from someone who wanted a piece moved without paperwork. We tightened security protocols, installed cameras, and began using insured transport for high-value items. I had to learn the legal side of things faster than I'd planned. Calls to lawyers and a growing comfort with formal agreements became a regular part of the job. Looking back, the noodle shop office felt like a rite of passage. It contained the low, raw edges of what building a business really is: fear, long nights, small miracles, and the slow accrual of trust. By the time we had offices in 2 cities and a small team who understood discretion, it was clear my life had pivoted from invisible labor to a craft people relied on. Mr. Conway's nudge had been the hand that started me moving, but the work that followed, the patience, the cold nights, the careful checks, was entirely mine. I never told them. I sat at Sunday dinners in Target brand clothes and ate turkey while my phone buzzed with encrypted messages about consignments and bids. No one at the table knew I was negotiating million-dollar deals between mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce. I got good at smiling and nodding, folding my life into a shape that looked small at family gatherings. It was a strange kind of theater: play the dutiful daughter, keep your hands clean, and keep your business running under a different light. When Mom fretted about bills, I sent money without signing my name. The transfers went out as anonymous deposits labeled something bland so no one would ask. I told myself it was partly guilt and partly practicality. I didn't want our family losing the house over bad timing or medical bills. I'd see her voice on the phone fray when she talked about another late notice, and something inside me folded. So I increased the monthly amounts when needed and pretended it was no one's business where the money came from. It felt safer that way. Megan, my sister, used that cushion differently. She bought designer bags and booked vacations and posted them with captions that sounded like a dare. She never once checked to see who paid the late bill or who quietly covered a medical copay. I watched those posts with a split feeling, part pride that she could live without worry, part anger that she seemed to think money was a mood rather than the byproduct of late nights and careful trades. Once quietly, I thought of leaving a note explaining how much time it had taken to get the accounts right. Instead, I transferred another amount, read a few more appraisal emails, and opened a ledger page to plan for a slow month. When Megan told Mom she was applying to a private MBA program with tuition that made my chest ache, Mom called me crying. "They won't give her scholarships," she said over and over, and the sound of it made me feel like I was back in the kitchen holding a trophy that fed no one. "Can you help, Em?" she asked in that small voice that always meant the request was a betrayal waiting to happen. I increased the anonymous support again because I thought it would keep something smooth between us, because I wanted to be the reason they didn't have to sell anything. I put the transfers on auto-pay and tried to forget the pinch that tightened each time the account numbers changed. Keeping secrets took work. I had to compartmentalize in a way that felt like wearing two skins. At the office, I was precise and discreet, calling collectors, arranging insured transports, writing provenance reports that could survive court. At home, I was careful about what I said and how I looked. I learned to change my tone when my mother asked, "How are things at work, Em?" I would say, "Fine," and swallow whole descriptions that could have made them proud. My private life became a series of coded silences. Even Grandma Rita, who'd always been my safe place, didn't know the full numbers. I wanted to tell her the truth because she taught me to read a mark, but I feared what it would do to her chest of memories. The duplicity wore me down like a stone rubbed smooth by a river. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and do the math again to make sure the transfers wouldn't ruin my cash flow. I'd check contract drafts twice because I feared a mistake that would cost clients money and expose everything. I told myself I was doing the right thing by keeping them secure and giving Megan the chance to build a life. But there were nights when the weight of it felt wrong, like I was laundering love through bank accounts and waiting for someone to notice. Megan did notice in her own way, but not the way I would have chosen. On that Thanksgiving, she grabbed my laptop and spun it toward the table. The screen showed a balance that belonged to me and not to any of them, $13,834,200 plus contracts waiting to be signed. I remember the way her smirk cut through the room and how quickly the conversation shifted from gratitude to entitlement. "Is this all yours, Em?" she asked like it was an accusation written by committee. In the minutes that followed, everything I'd held tight unspooled. I told them I'd been the one sending the anonymous money. I told them I'd built a business from a love of old things and hard hours. I tried to explain why I'd kept it quiet: privacy for clients, protection for my work, a fear that sudden wealth would become a target. But the room wanted immediate solutions: trusts, shares, vacation houses, retirement funds. Their questions felt like demands. Megan's voice turned sharp. "You owe us," she said, flat and certain, as if the balance on a screen erased years of choices and effort. When I left that night, I thought I would be racing back to calm everything down. Instead, I walked away because something new had settled in my chest, an edge that told me my generosity had not been simple charity but a choice that deserved boundaries. The transfers stopped, and the quiet accounting of my life began to rearrange itself. I had thought anonymity would keep the peace, but it had only delayed the reckoning until numbers were too loud to ignore. They turned on me fast. The room that had been full of holiday noise bent into one single idea: I was hoarding. My sister Megan, my mother Teresa, and my father Mark spoke first with anger that sounded like entitlement. "You kept all this and let us struggle," Megan hissed, as if the sum on my laptop erased the years I'd paid things anonymously. They wanted trusts, payouts, immediate access, and their questions came with a moral tone like they'd been keeping the ledger of virtue, while I'd been keeping the money. I left the house because staying felt like signing my own surrender. I walked into the cold night with my coat wrapped tight and my keys in my fist, and I called my bank the minute I sat in my car. "Cancel the transfers," I told the customer service rep, voice steady despite the run of adrenaline. "Stop the recurring payments to my parents." It felt like turning off a faucet that had been leaking for years. I imagined their gasps, their sudden scramble to remember which bill was paid by what hand, but the relief in my chest was real and immediate. They didn't let it rest. The phone calls started almost before the drive ended, one then 10 then dozens. Texts piled up in a family group chat that turned into a courtroom full of accusations, and their friends joined in online rants that felt like a community verdict. My social feeds filled with comments from people I barely knew, people adding moral lectures about obligation and blood ties. I watched notifications spike like a fever chart while my stomach went hollow. "You owe us," Megan kept posting, "family first." The phrase was used like a cudgel. The group escalation took a physical turn when a cousin drove down from Ohio, and then another relative came with a friend. They showed up at my firm uninvited, expecting a meeting that I had not scheduled, assuming my professionalism would fold under the weight of kin. They walked through the lobby and asked for me like they expected to be welcomed. My receptionist called security because I hadn't told anyone they were allowed. I heard the dispatcher's voice over the hall's speaker and felt a strange mix of shame and rightness. Security escorted them out politely but firmly, and I placed their names on a do not admit list that felt like a legal coat hanger for doors I would not open to them again. After they were removed, the harassment kept coming in subtler and nastier forms. I started getting fake emails from strangers pretending to be contractors asking for bank details. New phone numbers called with thin threats about public shaming. Someone tried to post doctored screenshots on social media implying I had stolen family money. It was a smear campaign that relied on volume and repetition, and the noise was exhausting. I filed legal warnings through my counsel and had them sent to everyone who kept crossing that line. The letters were formal and small, but they worked like a fence. The calls slowed enough that I could breathe between them. Grandma Rita, my grandmother, surprised them and comforted me in a way they hadn't expected. She called my parents and in her gravelly, clear voice told them she was proud of the life I had made. "She did this herself," Grandma said. "She worked nights and learned her trade. You should be proud, not resentful." Hearing her was a balm. Her support was plain and fierce, and it shifted something in the family conversation. My parents grumbled and pushed back at first, but there was a weakening in their voice after her call, like a string that had been pulled too tight and finally let out. The legal warnings did more than stop some of the noise, they made the stakes clear. I set up a formal mail channel for any legitimate family requests and told a lawyer to handle contact until things cooled. That decision felt cold and adult, but it kept my firm safe and my staff out of the middle. Clients respected the boundaries when I explained the situation privately. Some sent notes of support, others called to ask if I was all right. Business continued because discretion is valuable and because we had built a reputation for handling sensitive matters. In the months that followed, the harassment faded to a distant crackle. The family drama didn't disappear entirely, but the immediate threat to my work and safety eased. Every choice came with cost. I lost a version of what I thought family might be when money entered the room, and I learned I could not simply be the secret benefactor and also remain invisible. The transfers stopped, the do not admit list stayed active, and I let the legal team handle the rest. I learned to let security be the first line between my life and people who confused love with entitlement. Grandma Rita's voice stayed with me steady and proud, and it became a small, stubborn island of truth I could return to when the rest of the world felt loud and unfair. 6 months later, things are quieter in a way that feels like recovery. I moved into a safer house with better locks and an alarm that actually picks up the phone at night. I changed my number, rerouted mail, and installed a small safe in a locked office I can reach without walking through a lobby. At work, we tightened security the same way: new protocols for client drop-offs, secure couriers, and a receptionist trained to refuse anyone without an appointment. It felt practical, like mending a fence after someone tried to walk through my backyard. Business didn't fall apart when I pulled back from family obligations. If anything, it grew in a healthier way because I enforced boundaries and protected my clients. High-profile collectors started calling because they liked that I didn't put their purchases on display or gossip about provenance. An estate lawyer recommended me to a client who wanted absolute discretion. "We don't want headlines," she said on the phone, and I understood exactly what she meant. My team and I handled the work quietly, and the firm's reputation for accuracy and secrecy brought in contracts that paid well and didn't ask me to sacrifice my privacy. Mom and Dad, my parents, slowed down after their lawyer warned them about the repercussions of the way they behaved. I think the legal letter did what my words couldn't: it created distance. They still called sometimes in a softer voice, asking small things that felt like probes. I answered politely and kept the conversation short. "We're managing," I would say, and then steer the topic back to a simple update about the weather or a local news item. It was strange to become the adult who closed the door for my own parents, but I learned that love isn't always measured by how quickly you hand over money. Megan, my sister, kept performing her version of grievance online. She posted thinly veiled rants and then a follow-up claiming she'd start her own modest venture as if that solved everything. I scrolled past her updates more than I reacted. Once, a friend called and asked if I'd seen Megan's latest story. "She's advertising a course on starting a business," my friend said. I laughed in a private way because I could tell from her photos the production value leaned expensive and the product likely hollow. I didn't want to fuel her by responding publicly. Distance has a strange way of muting dramas that once felt like earthquakes. For the first time in my life, I feel a fresh kind of freedom. I don't go to Sunday dinners to play small or to swallow remarks that pin me down. I don't sit through backhanded compliments that are really obligations in disguise. I can say no without collapsing into guilt. Saying no feels less like a door slamming and more like a pure, clear decision that keeps my work and my safety intact. I sleep better. I take walks without calculating whether I'm answering a hidden bill or stepping into another role that drains me. Therapy has been a steady ballast. I sit with someone who doesn't have family ties to my history and can name the patterns I lived under. "You were invisible by design," she said once, and the phrase landed like a map. We work through anger and grief and practical plans for boundaries. I practice conversations out loud so that when someone angers me, I don't replay old reflexes. I've learned to set limits in a way that feels firm but not cruel. Therapy taught me that generosity is fine, but it shouldn't make you disappear. Grandma Rita, my grandmother, still comes over and we catalog together. She loves the work like it's both hobby and faith. She sits with a loop and a steady hand and tells stories about a maker who signed in tiny letters or a clasp that was popular in a particular village. Her presence steadies me in a way money never could. "You did it, Emily," she says, and when she calls me by name like that, I feel the old ache ease. We laugh at small things and argue over identification until one of us is right, and then we celebrate with tea and those old cookies she still makes. The last private joke lands like a small, satisfying click in a lock. Megan posted a picture wearing what she called a vintage Cartier bracelet, all gleam and brag. My first instinct was to roll my eyes, but then I pulled the image up on a secure device and looked for the telltale hallmarks. The bracelet was wrong, the clasp finish, the placement of the hallmark, the weight. I knew at once it was a fake and not a well-made reproduction. I could have told the world, but I didn't. Instead, I smiled, told Grandma Rita, and filed the observation under things that remind me why discretion matters. The joke stayed private between us, and it felt like a small, clean victory in a life I'm finally allowed to live on my own terms. Thanks for watching. Make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video. And drop a comment below, I'd love to hear your thoughts.